Okay, welcome everyone. So this is the last part of Unit 1. So this is Learning Outcome 8. This is the nervous system. It's best considered alongside the reading either from your manual, sorry, or the reading that I've sent out separately. And hopefully this lecture kind of acts to sort of fill in a few gaps. There's only 10 slides really. So I'm trying to keep it quite sort of concise and sort of link it into the answers that you're asked to give in your workbook. So what you'll see on most of the slides, I've given a kind of a bit of a bullet pointed summary. So hopefully you can sort of draw enough information from that to make your workbooks quite easy to complete. Let's crack on. So the aims really are what I want you to do is by the end of the session understand the nervous system. It's a huge topic, so what we're trying to do is kind of pick out bits that are relevant for you and sort of give a couple of ideas about how it might relate to your role as a fitness instructor. This is expanded upon quite a lot on the personal training course, and you could sort of get the opportunity to dig into it a little bit deeper. So at the minute we're looking at really sort of broad concepts and sort of getting familiar with the terminology that we're using. So hopefully by the end of the session you'll be able to describe the role and functions of the nervous system. You'll describe the principles of muscle contraction. You'll describe the all or none law of motor unit recruitment, and describe how exercise can enhance neuromuscular connections and improve motor fitness. So let's crack on with that. To begin with, this shows the nervous system organization. So if we think of the nervous system, it is a system that is really governed by our central nervous system. So this is our brain and our spinal cord. So if you look at that little section in blue, we have to say that our nervous system consists of, and then it breaks down into those two parts. So on the right hand side it says the central nervous system, which acts as an integrating center. So this means it kind of integrates all input that nerves and your sensory systems pick up and give to your brain. So this could be things like touch, temperature. It could be the input we get from our sight. So all of these are just being delivered to our brain by nerves. So all our brain really integrates that, it processes it, and it makes us recognize things. It makes us recognize things when they feel touch. It recognizes these patterns that these this kind of nerves in our eyes, if you like, have delivered to the brain to sort of make up pictures. It's just an enormously complex group of little neurons and their supporting structures. So the central nervous system integrates all this information and it really creates responses. So for example, in movement, it might create a group of a sort of a pattern of muscle contraction and it wants you to carry out. So really our peripheral nervous system, this thing in that yellow box, has a sort of twin role. It feeds that central nervous system, if you like, with information, but it also acts to affect those responses. So it affects things like muscle contraction, heart's beating, breathing rate increasing. So our nervous system is primarily governed by this central nervous system, but it needs to be able to communicate with the whole of the rest of the body, and it does this via the peripheral nervous system, and we'll talk about each one of those systems in a second. The boxes to the side show the two sections of that peripheral nervous system. There's a sensory division of the peripheral nervous system, so all that sort of information, our touch, the temperature, about joint position, even the internal sort of status of our body is being fed into our brain. So the sensory division of the peripheral nervous system sends information to the central nervous system via what are called afferent neurons. So these are effectively sort of nerve cells. The efferent division of the peripheral nervous system takes information from the central nervous system to target cells via what are called efferent neurons. So again, these are efferent kind of nerve cells. So that's the sort of broad overview. The nervous system is made up of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And essentially that peripheral nervous system takes information from the body and brings it in towards the brain. But also it takes messages and signals from that central nervous system and delivers it to those target tissues throughout the rest of the body. So we'll talk about the central nervous system, and in your workbook you're asked to describe the role and functions of the nervous system. So you basically, what does it do? So if we think of our central nervous system, with that picture on the left hand side sort of shows what that is. And it's got the brain and the spinal cord. So if you just pause the presentation and think, what does your brain do? So if you've had to think about what your brain does, it's pretty wild. It's a pretty sort of, it's hard to sort of isolate what it does. Is one thing it acts as a real processor. It processes an enormous amount of information. So on a simple sense, it processes things like sensation, so touch, temperature, things like vibration. All of these things are picked up by nerves under the skin. Those nerves are triggered. They provide input to the brain. They say, we're being triggered. And the brain sort of processes that information and recognizes it. And we sense it as things like temperature changes, light touch, deep touch. So the brain processes sensation and other sensory information. It processes and organizes memory. It also recalls and can create things like emotions, so really things that are very difficult to kind of define. It also processes lots of information that's coming from inside our body, things like what blood pressure, fuel levels, things like sort of glucose levels in the body, also hormonal status of the body. So it acts as a real processor of information. It also then directs movement. So it directs movement and also creates the fine coordination of that movement. It directs things like heart rate and breathing rate changes. So these things are sort of monitored by the brain, and then it affects those responses by increasing heart rate, increasing breathing rate. And it also directs the releases of hormones throughout our body, these chemical messengers that are released into our bloodstream to affect all the different organs throughout our body. So they're there to maintain what's called homeostasis, our body's sort of sense of balance. So the function of the brain is it's much broader than I've considered here, but those are just a few ideas of what it does. And then if you think about what your spinal cord does, so you're asked to describe the role and functions of the nervous system. So you can sort of say, well, the brain is there as a processor of information, you give me some ideas. It also acts to direct changes. It creates thoughts, emotions as well. So what does your spinal cord do? Well, really, it's there to relay signals. It's like your brain creates signals. Let's say it wants to move my arm. So I think about it. So I want to move my arm. Okay, great. I'll move my arm. Now, to do that, my brain has had to create a pattern. It's sort of drawn on the patterns of movement that it's got in my library, and effectively it's sent that pattern of information, those patterns of signals down my spinal cord. Now, at the spinal cord, they communicate with nerves, so peripheral nerves, that travel to the muscles that will affect my arm. So the spinal cord is really a sort of a group of tracks that allow that information, those signals, to be sent down. So the tracks relay signals from the brain to muscles and organs. They also relay signals from the peripheral nerves, so they to get it to the brain. So peripheral nerves, so the nerves on the periphery of my body, supply information. So let's say I touch my finger. Let's say take a little. I've got a sort of toothpick here. Prick my finger. So there. So as I touch deep, that begins to hurt. So that information travels from my hand. These are peripheral nerves bringing it from my hand all the way up into my neck. And in my neck, that nerve will join the spinal cord, or will communicate with the spinal cord. That will relay that message up to my brain, where it says, I can feel that, that is painful. So the spinal cord takes signals from the brain and allows it to communicate with those peripheral nerves to affect movement. And it also allows the communication of signals from the periphery upwards towards the brain. It also processes reflexes. So if you've ever been to a doctor and they've whacked your knee with a little reflex hammer, that's the spinal cord doing that processing. So an impulse comes from the knee to the spinal cord, and rather than ascending up for your brain to process, make a response, send it down, out to the side again, that spinal cord just bounces that back. It's received an impulse that's of such importance, it processes it and bounces it back to effect a response, that reflex. So the spinal cord relays signals from the brain, or acts as a pathway to allow signals from the brain to communicate with those peripheral nerves. The peripheral nerves bring information from the periphery, and the spinal cord allows information to ascend up the brain through these tracts, and it also allows the processing of reflexes. So here's a picture from the peripheral nervous system. So you're asked to describe the role and functions of those peripheral nervous system. So I really, in the previous picture, I kind of hinted at this. Now, if I've put that sort of picture I showed at the very start, just in that top right hand side. So the nervous system is made of the central nervous system, in that purple blob on the right hand side, and the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, if you follow that down, has a sensory part and a motor part. So a sensory information from touch, joint position, temperature, all is allowed to come from the peripheral, from the body, the peripheral nerves, and be brought to our spinal cord. And there, that message, those impulses, are sent towards the brain. So in that central picture that I've got here, you can see there's a little piece of skin, and you can see on that skin there's a little nerve that's in green. So I could do it like that. There we go. There. Can you see where it is? So the green nerve is just in the skin. So again, if you can imagine, I'm just poking my finger with my sort of toothpick thing that's being sensed. So that causes nerves to fire. That mechanical input causes nerves to fire. And you can see that sensory neuron delivers that impulse all the way into that spinal cord. Can you see where it says interneuron? And you can see that's right in that grey matter of the spine. And that input is going to be taken upwards through the spinal cord to the brain for it to process that information. So the peripheral nervous system sends information to the central nervous system through these afferent sensory neurons. So there's one of its roles. Now, you can see there's a bit of skeletal muscle as well. And you can see that's connected to a nerve. Here it's called the somatic motor neuron. So a nerve that is responsible for motor input. So input that's going to create movement. So you can see again that nerve or that neuron was initially attached to the spinal cord. Not attached, it's connected to the spinal cord. So you can see that cell or that neuron travels all that distance to that muscle. So here, when the brain wants to initiate movement or contract that muscle, it sends an impulse down the spinal cord. But to get to that muscle, that it needs a peripheral nerve. That peripheral nervous system takes information from the central nervous system to that target cell, i.e. the muscle, via these efferent neurons. In this case, it's that somatic motor neuron. So if that nerve was cut, that muscle would be completely sort of flaccid. It would be unable to contract. So you're then asked to describe the autonomic nervous system. Now the autonomic nervous system is quite an interesting thing. It's not really a separate part. It's not like the brain or the spinal cord. It's really a function of these parts. So sometimes it's quite a difficult thing to kind of conceptualize in a way. So if we think about a movement, let's say I wanted to pick up a dumbbell, I'm doing that consciously. If whilst I'm picking up that dumbbell, I'm having to work a little bit harder, my muscles need a little bit more blood going to them. So as a consequence, my heart rate increases. Now I don't think about that. I don't think I'm going to pick up that dumbbell, so I better make my heart beat a little bit more quickly so I can fuel that muscle. It doesn't work like that. So we have to have what's called this autonomic nervous system to do these automatic processes. So the autonomic nervous system is that role of the nervous system that controls our internal organs. Things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and various glands. All the things that maintain our, again, this concept of homeostasis. So it's responsible for regulating a really wide range of things. And I've got a few things here. So breathing, we don't sort of, we can consciously breathe. We can override our sort of natural breathing rhythm. We can hold our breath. But really that drive to increase our breathing rate is really determined by this autonomic nervous system. Heart rate is also determined by our autonomic nervous system. And also digestion. So the way that food is moving through the gut, the digestive enzymes that are secreted when we're eating, all of these things are determined by our autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is not under conscious control, although and most actions are initiated by the brain, and messages are then sent to organs via nerves or hormones, these chemical messengers that are released into the blood. So this picture here just sort of shows a really sort of broad organisation of what's called the autonomic nervous system, and I just put it up here. Sometimes you might see pictures like this in sort of various kind of medical settings. Within the autonomic nervous system, we talk about this concept of there being a parasympathetic and a sympathetic part of that nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for what might be called the fight or flight. So it goes back to our sort of times as cavemen. We have these sort of inbuilt drives. Now, if I was sort of wandering through the woods one night and I encountered a woolly mammoth or something, you know, big and scary, I've kind of got options. I can run away, take flight, or I can try and fight it. I don't fancy my chances. To do either of those, I need to really mobilize my body, and you might feel this when you're sort of really charged up and ready. If you play sport, you might get this feeling that you know the adrenaline is coursing through your veins, your heart is beating faster. So what you can see on the left hand side, it's a bit covered up actually by the my sort of formatting, but on the left hand side of that picture, it shows the sympathetic input to various organs of the body. Now, if you look, let's say, at the heart, can you find the heart right in the middle there? So the sympathetic nervous system on the left hand side accelerates the heart. So that's a direct connection from the nerves that actually exit our central nervous system. So they accelerate the heart, they increase the heart rate. Now, on the flip side, the parasympathetic nervous system, let's say I've run away from that woolly mammoth, I've found myself a little spot that, you know, some nice sort of clear grass, nothing's going to attack me, I can relax and calm down. Now I need that heart rate to slow down. So you can see on the right hand side that parasympathetic nervous system. Can you see that red line from the brain? So part of my brain is responsible for slowing down that heart rate. There's lots of other elements that you can see that are influenced by the various sections of that nervous system. Think about the other things that happen when you're very stressed, for example. If you're very stressed, the sympathetic nervous system is very dominant, so your heart rate rises. You sometimes sort of get almost kind of sweaty palms, and you know you feel tense. It's really your body kind of mobilizing you for exercise, really. But because you're not able to, it sometimes it sort of it creates quite a lot of sort of negative effects on the body. Now, one of those things you can see here on the middle, a couple below the heart, you can see the digestive system. So one of the things that happens when we are in a sympathetic state is that it says that inhibits secretion. So the sympathetic state does a couple of things. It inhibits the secretion of digestive enzymes, and it also closes off blood vessels. It constricts blood vessels in the digestive system to allow blood to not pool in that digestive system, to make it available for working muscles, because I'm going to be running or fighting, I think. That's what my brain's telling me. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system kind of does the opposite. So when I'm sat on my little bit of nice cool grass and eating that apple I found, now I'm able to calm down, and that parasympathetic nervous system actually stimulates secretion of digestive enzymes. It stimulates the movement of food through my gut, so blood flow is allowed back into that digestive system and able to start doing the peristalsis that I need to digest my food. So the sympathetic nervous system is really about mobilizing the body for exercise. and the that should say parasympathetic nervous system. I've done a typo there. The parasympathetic nervous system is really that part that's responsible for the resting and the digesting. So you're then asked to describe the principles of muscle contraction. This is quite a tricky one. I'm going to talk through a little bit of it now, and then I'm going to send some additional notes that you might use to provide some more depth in your explanations. The first thing that's really important is to consider this concept of motor units. So we'll dig into that now. Now, nerves transmit electrochemical impulses from the central nervous system to muscles via the peripheral nervous system. So let's break that down a little bit. So if we think about, let's say, a movement, I will want to initiate a movement by sending an impulse from my brain. So that brain sends an impulse, sends a pattern of movement down through my spinal cord. It communicates with my muscles via that peripheral nervous system. So the way impulses move through nerves to get there is through these electrochemical impulses from the central nervous system. Sorry, it's through these electrochemical impulses. So it's kind of a form of electricity going through these nerves. It's the movement of charged ions being drawn into the nerves that creates that electrochemical impulse. At the muscles, so what you see on that picture, you can see nerves that are connected to muscle fibers. So if, for example, you looked at let's say you chose the red one, it's called on there neuron 1. So if you look at that, it begins in the spinal cord, or it's connected to the spinal cord, and then that neuron 1 is going to have a contact with each of those little red muscle fibers. So at those muscle fibers, that nerve releases chemical messengers into those muscle fibers. The chemical messenger, that signal molecule, is called a neurotransmitter. So that's kind of saying from the nerve, I'm transmitting that signal into that muscle fiber. So the nerve itself is sort of sending that signal into that muscle fiber saying you need to contract. So if that muscle fiber receives enough of that neurotransmitter, that muscle fiber is then going to contract. So here what we've got is what's called a motor unit. So a group of muscle fibers by one motor neuron is called a motor unit. So there's 3 motor units. Neuron 1 is causing all those red muscle fibers to contract. Neuron 2 is causing all the blue ones to contract. And neuron 3 is causing all the purple ones to contract. So the individual nerve causes individual muscle fibers to contract. So there's principle number 1. So muscle fibers are innervated by individual nerves. So when the nerve fires, all the attached fibers will contract. They'll twitch. They'll twitch and then relax. Now, if I want them to twitch and stay contracted, I need to send repeated impulses to increase that strength of contraction. So you're asked for 8.3 to describe the all or none law of motor unit recruitment. So what you should have seen in the previous picture is that motor unit is a group of nerves, a group of muscle fibers supplied by a single nerve. So this picture shows that quite nicely. You can see on there we've got a neuron, a nerve, and at the top, can you see that those little tree-like bits? It's called dendrites. So it says dendrites, tree-like extensions that receive information from another neuron or cell body. So in the previous picture, you could see that those dendrites will receive information from within that spinal cord. That's their connection. Now, when they receive enough information, when they receive enough impulse from other nerves, that nerve will transmit that impulse in the form of something called an action potential, but only when enough impulse is received. So the concept is really action potentials are electrical signals nerves use to transmit impulses. So if I need to get a message to that little muscle fiber at the bottom, I need an action potential to have travelled from those dendrites all the way down the length of that nerve, down what's called the axon. You can see that there, the long bit of a nerve. So action potentials travel from the dendrites, where it's received that input, all the way down that axon. Now, the concept of this all or none law are that impulse will either fire and go all the way down to that muscle fiber, or it won't. That sounds pretty obvious, straightforward, but essentially what it's saying is that there's no grading. You can't give those muscle fibers sort of a half-hearted contraction. So effectively, when those dendrites, those tree of dendrites are receiving input, if only a couple are stimulated, there might not be enough input for the axon, for the neuron, to cross what's called the threshold. So if there's only small inputs, small little signals coming into it, it might just, it's almost kind of not enough to initiate that whole action potential that's going to find its way down to that muscle. Now, if you think of now, there's a huge drive. Let's say there is a real requirement for large muscle contraction. Now, those dendrites are going to be receiving lots of signals from my brain. So my brain is sending impulses down my spinal cord, and now those dendrites are picking up those signals. They're saying, boom, this has got to happen. Enough input arrives at those dendrites to cross the threshold. So now an impulse will travel all the way down that nerve, all the way down that neuron, into the muscle fiber, or to as far as the muscle fiber. It will cause those fibers to contract. So the all or none phenomena really is that if the dendrites receive information or input from a nerve that is a low strength, it won't cross that threshold, and there'll be no action potential making its way to that muscle fiber. But if the input exceeds that threshold level, the action potential will proceed. So this last note I've got here, it won't be stronger if more impulses are received. It will just cross that threshold and transmit that information or that impulse down to that muscle fiber. If I want to make that fiber contract more strongly, I have to send repeated impulses. So I need to sustain that input, to sustain that drive. But that's really something that's happening at that fiber. the strength of the nerve either transmits information or it doesn't. It doesn't transmit information and say, contract a little bit stronger, would you? It just says, contract, contract, contract. But if repeated impulses are put onto that fibre, then the fibre is able to contract a little bit more strongly. So it will not be stronger if more input is received, so the nerve will transmit all the signal or none of it. So if you want to get that muscle at the end to contract more strongly, you need to provide repeated action potentials. So we come to the last slide. And this asks, how can exercise enhance neuromuscular connections and improve motor fitness? So again, this is something that people do whole master's levels degrees on. So we're just kind of giving you a couple of ideas that you can think about. So number one, think about what strength is. Strength isn't just about big muscles. You can have people who are incredibly strong but also incredibly small. How is that possible? Well, a lot of it is about this concept of recruiting motor units. Now, I might arrive at a gym as an untrained newbie, and you might put me on a shoulder press machine and I can do 10 kilos, let's say. 10 kilos, 5 kilos per arm. Now, you might think, that's not great for a big chap, but it's the first time I've done it. Now, you might sort of set me up with a nice program, give me some nice tips, and then 2 weeks later you see, I've got 20 kilos on it now. Now, my muscles, I've doubled the amount I'm lifting. I haven't doubled the size of my muscle. You wouldn't be able to tell that I've been working out after 2 weeks. But how did I get so much stronger? How did I double my strength in such a short space of time? Because you see it a lot certainly in beginners. You see these huge changes. So one of the things that happens is we're able to recruit more motor units than untrained individuals. So the fact is, if you recruited every single muscle fibre in your muscle, you would probably rip the tendon off the bone. So your body has this built-in sort of safety valve, if you like. Training, and particularly strength training, allows you gradually to push that valve a little bit higher. So you're able to recruit more muscle fibres with each lift. So you might have two people with exactly the same size muscles, but the person who's able to recruit a larger percentage of that muscle when they exercise is the one who's going to demonstrate that strength. So strength isn't just about bigger muscles, it's also about how you recruit those muscle fibres. So training also develops our ability to fire more action potential. So that previous picture I said is that the action potential that travels down the axon and arrives at a muscle fibre, it either fires or it doesn't. At the muscle fibre, it creates a twitch. The muscle fibre will twitch. To increase strength, you don't give a stronger nerve impulse, you just give repeated nerve impulses. So training develops our ability to fire more action potentials repeatedly at muscle fibres to increase that strength. The really important thing, and this is really key with lots of strength training, it actually allows us to create more coordinated, efficient contractions. So, someone who's new to something like deadlifting, for example, it's a new skill. Lots of compound lifts are skilled. The fact is, as we become more skilled at things, we become more efficient. Our timing improves. The way the coordination between our muscle groups is much more efficient. And that's really a function of the patterns that are being created in our central nervous system. So as we become more skilled, our brain develops skilled patterns of coordinated movement, these things called motor patterns. So this allows us to create much more coordinated, efficient movement. It makes this efficient movement become more automatic. Training helps patterns of movement become automatic and ingrained. So think about if you've ever tried to learn a racket sport. You know, your whole concentration goes onto where your foot's landing. You're watching this ball. You're concentrating on the ball. You're sort of thinking, have I taken that bat far back enough? Am I swinging it through enough? Am I stood in the right position? You watch a good tennis player, they're not thinking about that. They're just thinking, I'm going to put my opponent over there, I'm going to come into the net in a minute, I'm going to hit the ball down there. It's tactics. So all the skill has become automatic. And there's a similar thing with training, is that good, repeated, good quality patterns of movement allow these skills to become ingrained and automatic. It allows you then to put your effort and your focus on working harder, training in particular, maybe sort of more unstable surfaces, just mixing it up and having fun with your training. But it's that point, you know, training gives us that ability. It gives us that ability to create these skilled and enhanced movement patterns that become automatic. One of the benefits also, if you think about, for let's say you've got a client with low back pain, if you can create movements that are, you know, things like sort of good deadlift patterns that might spare the back a little bit when they're lifting up things, you know, these become automatic. It makes their everyday movements become that little bit more efficient, and that sort of enhances their ability to remain injury free. So hopefully there's some ideas for you there. You may have chosen to fill in your workbook as you go along. I'm going to send out a little bit more for 8.2. It's a really tough question actually, what it's asking you to do. So I'm going to try and send a little bit more of a kind of a bit of a guidance document to help you with that. Otherwise, I'll let you crack on with your workbook, and if you have any problems, do get in touch. Okay, thanks a lot.